Money buys almost everything. Politicians, silence, even heart transplants. But when a billionaire CEO's world collapsed over a broken piece of metal, her limitless bank account was completely useless. The original engineers gave up, but a tired single dad with a rusty screwdriver, he fixed it in 2 minutes. Claire stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, looking down at the crawling yellow cabs of Manhattan. She was 38, unmarried, and worth $4.2 billion. She routinely dismantled legacy corporations before her morning coffee. She bought senators. She bought silence. She bought anything that possessed a price tag. But right now, her money was just green paper, and she was entirely powerless. Behind her, the shrieks tore through the sterile, minimalist suite. They weren't the standard tantrums of an overtired child. They were sharp, rhythmic, and terrifyingly breathless, the panicked system overload screams of a 6-year-old girl whose reality had just been shattered. "I don't care about the supply chain, Henri." Claire hissed into her phone, her knuckles turning white. "I don't care if the original schematics burned down in a fire in 1940. I will buy your entire manufacturing facility right now. I will wire $50 million to your personal account. Send an engineer on a supersonic jet." On the other end of the line, sitting in a pristine laboratory in Geneva, the head of the world's most prestigious horology and automaton restoration firm, let out a soft, patronizing sigh. "Madame Kensington, please, this is not a matter of capital," Henri said, his Swiss-French accent thick with unearned superiority. "The mechanism inside the Silver Songbird is entirely bespoke. The escapement wheel is shattered. The mainspring barrel is warped. It requires a specific alloy cast in a specific mold cooled over 3 weeks. Even if you bought my company, physics dictates it cannot be fixed today. Even the manufacturer cannot fix this. It is a dead machine. Give the child an iPad." Claire ended the call. She didn't throw the phone. Throwing things was for people who lacked control, and Claire's entire life was predicated on absolute, rigid control. Instead, she walked over to the sprawling marble dining table. Sitting dead in the center was a silver cage, no larger than a melon. Inside was a mechanical songbird. It had belonged to Claire's grandmother. For the last 4 years, it was the only thing that could pull her daughter Sophie out of a severe autistic meltdown. The rhythmic whir of the brass gears, the specific tinny warble of the mechanical whistle, the predictable opening and closing of the silver beak, it was Sophie's anchor. 3 hours ago, the housekeeper had bumped the table. The cage fell onto the hardwood. The bird stopped singing. Sophie started screaming, and she hadn't stopped since. Claire looked at her daughter. Sophie was curled into a tight ball on the $30,000 custom rug, pulling at her own hair, her face mottled and slick with sweat. The nanny, a 24-year-old girl who was currently being paid triple overtime, stood awkwardly in the corner, holding a glass of water that neither of them wanted. "Sophie, baby," Claire said, dropping to her knees. Her custom-tailored slacks pooled on the floor. She reached out, but Sophie violently flinched away the scream, pitching higher raw and scraping. Claire felt a cold, jagged rock of failure sit heavy in her stomach. She could liquidate assets. She could restructure debt. But she couldn't fix her daughter's pain. She had thrown her entire arsenal of wealth and influence at a broken toy, and the world had looked back and said, "No." She dragged herself back up and walked to the table. The Swiss engineers had walked her through opening the base via video call before declaring it dead. The brass guts of the machine were exposed. It looked like a tiny, exploded bomb of gears and springs. The escapement wheel, a tiny star-shaped piece of brass, hung loose, disconnected from the main gear train. Claire stared at it. She hated it. She hated that this tiny, insignificant collection of metal had more power over her family than she did. She reached for her phone to call her assistant. She needed a doctor, a sedative, something, anything. The lights in the penthouse suddenly flickered, buzzed, and died. The scream from the floor faltered into a gasp of pure terror in the sudden dark before returning twice as loud. Claire closed her eyes. Perfect. Alexander dragged his worn leather boot against the threshold of the service elevator, staring blankly at the digital floor indicator. He was exhausted down to the marrow of his bones. He was 41. He smelled faintly of industrial degreaser and old coffee. He had $52 in his checking account, an overdue electric bill, and a dull, throbbing ache in his lower back that he ignored because doctors cost money. He worked maintenance for the hotel, a job that basically required him to be a ghost who plunged toilets and reset breakers for people whose shoes cost more than his car. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was his sister. Toby finally fell asleep, the text read. He asked if you were coming home to read the book. Alexander swallowed hard, staring at the screen. Tell him I'm sorry. Tell him I'll read 2 chapters tomorrow. Love you both. Being a single dad wasn't a tragedy. It was just gravity. It was a constant heavy pull that you learned to walk under. His ex-wife had walked out 3 years ago, leaving Alexander with a mortgage he couldn't afford, and a boy who didn't understand why his mother didn't want him. Alexander sold the house. He took the night shift. He did what had to be done. The elevator dinged at the penthouse level. The concierge had radioed about a blown zone breaker in the Kensington suite. Alexander stepped into the foyer. The door to the main suite was ajar, propped open, by a frightened-looking young woman holding a glass of water. Alexander slipped past her, his heavy tool belt clinking softly. The moment he crossed the threshold, the noise hit him. It wasn't just crying. It was the desperate rhythmic keening of a child trapped in their own head. He knew that sound. Toby used to make that exact sound in the months after the divorce when the routine broke. It was the sound of a world collapsing. He moved silently to the breaker panel, hidden behind a discreet walnut panel near the kitchen. He flipped the cover open, spotted the tripped switch and slammed it back into place. The recessed lighting flooded the room. Alexander closed the panel and turned to leave. That was the rule. Fix the problem. Be invisible. Get out. But as he turned, he saw her. Claire Kensington was standing by the dining table. She looked like a woman who was actively drowning, but refusing to ask for a life preserver. Her makeup was flawless. Her clothes were impeccable, but her eyes were bloodshot, staring blankly at a pile of disassembled metal on the table. On the floor, the little girl was rocking, violently, hands clamped over her ears. Alexander hesitated. He should walk away. It wasn't his business. People like Claire Kensington didn't want to be perceived by people like him, especially not in a moment of weakness. He took a step toward the door. The little girl shrieked a raw, ragged sound that scraped against the inside of Alexander's skull. He stopped. He looked at the table. He saw the silver bird. He saw the exposed gears. You need to leave, Claire said. Her voice was flat, hard, and entirely devoid of warmth. It was a voice designed to end conversations. Alexander didn't move. He walked slowly toward the marble table. I said, Claire repeated her tone, dropping an octave. You need to leave. The lights are on. Get out of my room before I have hotel security throw you out. Alexander ignored her. He looked down at the mechanism. Don't touch that, Claire snapped, stepping between him and the table. Do you have any idea what that is? It's a 19th century automaton. The chief engineer of the firm that built it just told me it is irreparably destroyed. The bespoke escapement is warped. The tension barrel is shot. So unless you have a master's degree in micromechanics hiding in that tool belt, back away. Alexander looked at her. He didn't see a billionaire. He saw a terrified, exhausted mother. "My kid used to scream like that," Alexander said quietly. His voice was gravelly quiet. It didn't boom, but it cut through the noise of the room perfectly. When his mom left, he couldn't process it. Everything had to be exactly right, or the world ended. The blue cup, the specific blanket. If it wasn't right, he was gone. Claire blinked. The sheer audacity of this maintenance man, speaking to her like an equal, momentarily short-circuited her rage. "I don't care about your child," she said coldly. "Get out." "I know you don't," Alexander replied, pulling a pair of heavy, grease-stained reading glasses from his shirt pocket and slipping them on. "But I care about yours, and the guy in Switzerland is an idiot." He stepped past her. Claire was too stunned to physically stop him. Alexander looked at the brass wreckage. The Swiss guy wasn't entirely wrong. The escapement wheel was bent, unseated from its pivot. The tiny teeth couldn't catch the pallet fork, meaning the mainspring would just unwind freely or jam. To a purist, a restorer, it was dead. It needed to be rebuilt from scratch to be perfect. But Alexander wasn't a purist. He was a mechanic. He didn't need it to be perfect. He needed it to work. He reached into his tool belt and pulled out a battered Leatherman multi-tool and a small roll of electrical tape. "What are you doing?" Claire gasped, genuine panic bleeding into her voice. "That is a priceless antique stop." "It's not priceless right now," Alexander muttered, not looking up. "Right now it's a paperweight making your kid miserable." He used the needle-nose pliers of the Leatherman to gently, firmly grip the bent shaft of the escapement wheel. He didn't try to bend it back perfectly straight that would snap the brittle old brass. Instead, he forced it slightly further, at an angle deliberately warping it. "Are you insane?" Claire lunged forward. Alexander blocked her with his shoulder, a solid, immovable mass of denim and muscle. "Watch." With the wheel bent slightly off-axis, the teeth would no longer engage the broken side of the pallet fork. But to bridge the gap, Alexander needed a shim. Something to force the tension rod against the remaining good teeth. He dug into his pocket. He pulled out a crumpled receipt from a hardware store. He ripped a tiny sliver of the thick receipt paper, folded it twice with massive, calloused fingers that possessed surprising dexterity, and wedged it between the brass tension spring and the casing. He applied a drop of spit to the paper to swell the fibers, locking it in place. "Paper," Claire whispered, her voice laced with hysterical disbelief. "You just shoved garbage into a museum piece. Mechanics is just tension and release, lady," Alexander said. "Rich people overcomplicate it." He took his flathead screwdriver and pressed down on the mainspring catch. Click. The tension held. The folded paper pushed the spring just enough to force the warped wheel to catch the fork. Alexander wound the small silver key at the base 3 times. He set the mechanism upright. He hit the release lever. A tiny mechanical breath hissed through the small bellows. Chirp. The silver bird opened its beak. The gears whirred a slightly uneven clicking rhythm, but the tune rang out clear and high. The bird turned its head. On the floor, the screaming instantly stopped. The silence that followed was so absolute it felt heavy. Sophie uncurled from her ball. She blinked, her chest heaving, staring at the table. She scrambled up off the floor, walked over to the table, and rested her chin on the cool marble, watching the bird spin. Her breathing slowed. Her eyes glazed over with calm. Alexander stepped back, wiping his hands on his pants. He packed his Leatherman back into its worn leather sheath. Claire stood frozen. She looked at the bird. She looked at her daughter. Then slowly she looked at the man in the dirty boots. The man who had done in 2 minutes with a piece of trash what $50 million couldn't do. "How?" she whispered, her voice finally breaking. "Like I said," Alexander replied, turning toward the door. "It's just tension and release. You just have to know where the pressure belongs." Alexander was already halfway down the carpeted hallway by the time Claire's brain rebooted. For a decade, her reality had operated on a strict binary code. If a problem existed, a wire transfer eliminated it. But the silver bird was singing on the marble table, her daughter was breathing deeply, and the man who had authored this miracle was walking away with nothing. "Wait!" Claire called out. Her voice echoed down the long, empty corridor. Alexander didn't break his stride. He just kept walking toward the service elevator, his heavy boots sinking into the plush, custom-loomed wool. Claire practically sprinted. She caught the heavy metal door of the service elevator, just as it began to slide shut, throwing her forearm against the rubber bumper. The door sensed the resistance and bounced back open with a dull thud. Alexander stood in the center of the fluorescent-lit metal box. He looked at her arm, then up to her face. He didn't look impressed by her recklessness. He just looked like a man who wanted to go home. "I didn't dismiss you." Claire breathed, her chest heaving slightly. "My shift ends in 20 minutes, Alexander replied. He reached out and pressed the button for the basement. "I'm dismissing myself." "Name your price." Alexander paused. The elevator doors began to close again. Claire stepped fully inside the cab, letting the doors slide shut behind her. The box began its rapid descent, plunging through the core of the luxury high-rise. "I'm serious," Claire said, pulling a sleek, leather-bound checkbook from the pocket of her slacks. She clicked a silver pen. "The men in Geneva wanted 50,000 just to fly here and fail. You succeeded. Tell me what you want." Alexander leaned back against the scratched steel wall of the elevator. He looked at the checkbook. He looked at the pen. He thought about his electric bill. He thought about the final notice from the mortgage company sitting on his kitchen counter, glaring at him in red ink. He thought about the $52 in his account. He closed his eyes for a second. The exhaustion was a physical weight pressing down on his chest. "Put it away, lady." Claire stopped writing. She looked up, her brow furrowing in genuine confusion. "Excuse me." "Put the book away," Alexander repeated. He opened his eyes. They were hard, lacking any of the deference she was accustomed to. "I didn't do it for you. I don't want your money. Everyone wants money. I fixed a toy because a little kid was hurting," Alexander said quietly. "If I take a check for that, then I'm just charging you for my basic humanity. And frankly, I'm too tired to figure out the tax rate on that." "This isn't a philosophical debate." Claire snapped, her composure cracking. She hated this. She hated being indebted to someone who refused to let her buy her way out of the deficit. "You provided a service, a highly specialized service. You saved my daughter from a psychological break. Accept the compensation?" "No." $10,000. Alexander actually laughed. It was a dry, scraping sound, devoid of humor. "You really don't get it, do you? You think you can just write a number on a piece of paper and it cleans the slate. You think it makes us even." "It does make us even," Claire said firmly. "It doesn't." Alexander pushed himself off the wall. He stepped closer to her. He was a foot taller, broad-shouldered, carrying the distinct physical presence of a man who worked with his hands. But he didn't crowd her. He just looked down at her with a profound, crushing pity. "Because if I take your 10 grand, you go back to your penthouse, thinking the world works exactly the way you want it to. You go back to thinking you can buy an answer to every scream." The elevator chimed. The display flashed a bright green B2. "Your kid doesn't need a mechanic, Miss Kensington," Alexander said, as the door slid open to reveal the concrete walls of the loading dock. "She needs a mother who isn't afraid of the noise. The bird is a crutch. It's a piece of trash wrapped in silver. Next time it breaks, don't call Switzerland. Sit on the floor with her until the screaming stops." He stepped out of the elevator. Claire stood frozen in the cab. "Who are you?" she asked. Alexander didn't turn around. "Just the guy who changes the light bulbs." He walked away, disappearing into the maze of steam pipes and concrete pillars. Claire took the elevator back up. When she walked into the penthouse, the silence felt different. It wasn't the tense, brittle silence of held breath. It was soft. Sophie was asleep on the rug, curled around the base of the silver bird. The mechanical creature was silent now, its mainspring fully unwound. Claire walked over. She didn't call the nanny. She didn't call for a blanket. She sat down on the hardwood floor, crossing her tailored legs, and carefully pulled her daughter's head into her lap. Sophie stirred slightly, murmured a soft, nonsensical sound, and settled deep into her mother's warmth. Claire stroked her daughter's hair. She looked at the bird. She thought about a folded piece of hardware store receipt, wedged into a 19th century automaton. She thought about tension and release. She reached into her pocket with her free hand, pulled out her phone, and dialed the hotel's general manager. It was 3:14 a.m. The GM answered on the second ring, his voice panicked. "Miss Kensington, is everything all right? Is the suite—" The maintenance man on the night shift. Claire interrupted her voice, dropping to a low, commanding whisper so as not to wake her daughter. "Tall. Wears glasses. Carries a Leatherman. Alexander. Alexander Carter. Did he do something wrong, Ma'am? I can have him terminated immediately." "Tell me everything about him," Claire said. She listened. She listened to the story of a man who used to own a successful auto body shop in Queens. A man whose wife emptied the business accounts and fled to Florida with a personal trainer. A man who sold his tools to pay off the business debts so his employees wouldn't go bankrupt. A man who took the night shift at a hotel so he could walk his son to the bus stop every morning. Claire hung up the phone. She sat in the dark for a long time, watching the slow rise and fall of her daughter's chest. She realized Alexander Carter was wrong about one thing. She did think she could buy an answer to everything, but she was about to buy a very different kind of answer. The fluorescent lights of Alexander's kitchen flickered, buzzing with the irritating hum of a dying ballast. He stood at the counter, staring at a mug of instant coffee that tasted like burnt copper. It was 7:30 a.m. Outside his narrow window, the Bronx was waking up. Sirens wailed in the distance. The garbage trucks were grinding their way down the avenue. He heard the soft pad of small feet behind him. Alexander turned. Toby was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, rubbing his eyes. He was wearing oversized pajamas featuring faded cartoon dogs. He was 7 small for his age, with a mop of unruly brown hair. "Hey, buddy," Alexander said softly, putting the mug down. He knelt, ignoring the sharp crack of his knees, and opened his arms. Toby walked into them, burying his face in his father's neck. "You didn't read the book last night," the boy mumbled. Alexander closed his eyes, swallowing the lump of guilt that permanently lived in his throat. "I know, kiddo. The hotel needed me to stay late. A big machine broke. I had to fix it." "Did you fix it?" "Yeah, I fixed it. Can we read 2 chapters tonight?" 3. Alexander promised kissing the top of the boy's head. "Now go get dressed. Breakfast is in 5 minutes." Toby nodded and padded back down the hall. Alexander stood up. He walked over to the stack of mail on the counter. He pulled out the red envelope from the mortgage company. He had exactly 3 days to come up with $4,000, or they were initiating foreclosure proceedings on the small apartment. He didn't have $4,000. He had a folded 20 and some singles in his wallet. He reached for his phone to call his supervisor to beg for an advance. Someone knocked on the door. Alexander frowned. It wasn't a tentative neighborly knock. It was a sharp, rhythmic rap of knuckles against cheap wood. It was an expensive sound. He walked to the door and pulled it open. Claire Kensington stood in the dingy hallway. She was wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal trench coat, dark sunglasses, and held a slim leather portfolio. Two massive men in dark suits stood exactly 10 feet behind her eyes, scanning the peeling paint of the corridor. Alexander leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. He didn't look surprised. He just looked tired. "You're hard to track down, Alexander," Claire said, pulling off her sunglasses. "You brought goons to an apartment building in the Bronx." Alexander replied, his voice flat. "You're going to terrify Mrs. Gable in 4B. They're not goons, they're security, and I'm not here to fight. I told you last night, I don't want your check." "I know," Claire said. She stepped closer, invading his space, just enough to force him to make eye contact. "You made that abundantly clear. You don't want my charity. You don't want a payout. You want to suffer nobly so you can hold on to your pride." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Get off my stoop." "But I have a problem." Claire continued, ignoring his dismissal. "A real problem. Kensington Industries owns a robotics manufacturing plant in Ohio. For the past 6 months, my chief engineers who hold degrees from MIT and Stanford have been trying to solve a micro-tension issue in the joint assembly of a surgical robotic arm. They've burned through $12 million in R&D. Alexander stared at her. He didn't say a word. "They keep designing custom alloys," Claire said, her voice turning sharp with genuine frustration. "They keep trying to bend the metal to fit the math. They overcomplicate it, and every time they run a stress test, the arm snaps." She unzipped the leather portfolio. She pulled out a thick stack of glossy architectural schematics and shoved them against Alexander's chest. Reflexively, he put his hands up and caught the papers. "What is this?" he asked. "Those are the blueprints for the joint assembly," Claire said. "I looked into you, Alexander. You didn't just fix cars. You built custom suspension systems for off-road racing vehicles from scrap parts. You understand load dispersal. You understand tension." Alexander looked down at the top page. It was a highly complex rendering of a mechanical joint. Even with a passing glance, he could see the flaw. The pivot point was absorbing too much kinetic energy. It needed a secondary release valve, a shim. "They're locking the joint," Alexander muttered almost to himself. "There's nowhere for the kinetic energy to go when the arm stops moving. It snaps back on itself." Claire smiled. It was a small, dangerous smile. "How long would it take you to fix that?" Alexander looked up. "Give me a grinder, some scrap aluminum, and a decent welder 4 hours to build a prototype." "My engineers told me it would take another 6 months and $4 million. Your engineers are idiots." "I am aware." Claire took a step back. "I am firing the head of the Ohio division at noon today. The position of Chief Consultant of Mechanical Engineering is open. The salary is $250,000 a year, with a signing bonus of $50,000 paid immediately upon acceptance. You work from home. You set your own hours. You fly out to the plant only when a prototype needs physical stress testing." Alexander went perfectly still. The hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. He looked at the woman in the trench coat, searching her face for the trap. "This is a handout," he said, his voice thick. "You made up a job because I wouldn't take your cash. I don't do handouts," Claire said coldly. "I am a ruthless, deeply cynical capitalist, Alexander. My company is bleeding capital because my mechanics don't know how to build things. You do. I am buying your brain. You folded a piece of garbage and fixed a machine that my money couldn't touch. I want that level of practical genius on my payroll." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a sleek black fountain pen. She held it out to him. "I am not giving you a gift," Claire said softly, her eyes locking onto his. "I am offering a transaction. Equal value for equal value. You fix my machines. You get your life back." Alexander looked at the pen. He heard Toby humming in the kitchen, pouring cereal into a plastic bowl. He thought about the red envelope on the counter. He thought about reading 3 chapters tonight without his eyes burning from exhaustion. He didn't need to suffer nobly. He just needed to survive. Alexander took the pen. He flipped to the final page of the contract in the portfolio. He leaned the thick stack of papers against the wall of the hallway and signed his name. He handed the pen and the portfolio back to Claire. "I need the scrap aluminum delivered by tomorrow," Alexander said, his voice steady. "And I don't work weekends. That's my kids' time." "Understood," Claire said. She slipped the portfolio back under her arm. "Thank you, Alexander." "Thank you, Miss Kensington." Claire turned and walked down the hallway, her security detail falling into step behind her. Alexander watched her go. He closed the door, sliding the deadbolt into place. He walked back into the kitchen. Toby was sitting at the small table, munching on dry cereal. "Who was at the door, Dad?" Toby asked, kicking his legs under the table. Alexander looked at his son. For the first time in 3 years, the crushing, invisible weight on his chest was gone. The gravity had shifted. "Just a lady with a broken machine, buddy," Alexander said, pulling up a chair and sitting down beside his boy. "Just a broken machine. Sometimes the world tries to convince us that our value is tied to our bank accounts, our titles, or the diplomas on our walls. But true brilliance is often found in the calloused hands of those who simply refuse to quit." If this story reminded you that everyday grit beats elite arrogance, hit the like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more deep, grounded stories that prove the human spirit can fix anything.